Well, the time is just gone 8 minutes to 9 as we continue, and it's the time of the week. We bring you eThekwini Secure. We've got Crime Talk, our weekly edition, and we've got Imtiaz Syed standing by. Imtiaz, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yes, Imtiaz, there was a time when you could walk through cities, actually. You could do window shopping at night. And I'm sure you and I remember those days, freely. It was just such a pleasant experience being in a city. But looking at South Africa at this point in time, we're looking at most cities, majority of the cities right across the entire country, deteriorating to such an extent where forget walking in the city. You don't even want to drive through a city. And just to understand, how these cities have actually become so run down and become unlivable to a large
Mhm.
extent.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you really look at and let's talk about eThekwini Durban City Centre. Over the past, I think, 15 or 16 years, you'd see that the deterioration has been ongoing year on year and exponentially so. Now, what do we mean by a city being unlivable? I mean, there's two parts to it. One is the issue of urbanization, and the other one is taxations in terms of rates and your high cost of living, and not really cost of living, but when I speak to this, I'm talking about municipal bills and rates and electricity and water and all of these things that now compound for you not to be able to actually live within a city. And that's something that really we need to speak to now before it gets to a point where you're going to actually have rundown cities where really there'll be no income generating citizens living within those cities, and then it's just going to be turmoil thereafter. And those are the things that we are raising. I mean, right now within our city, we've got exponentially an increase of people coming into the city seeking work but ending up homeless on the streets. That's one part of the situation, right? But obviously you've seen, and in June this year there was a budget passed wherein it was called a pro-poor budget. Now let's speak to this and try and understand. I mean, there's two types of expenditures in the city. I've went through this before, but ultimately the taxation of it comes down to the ratepayer who's been living in the city for a while. However, those funds are now diverted to create this perception that the ruling party within the city is now a government that's taking care of the poor, but in fact at the cost of the ratepayer. And that's a cause for concern, because ultimately when you go down this path, you make the city extremely vulnerable in terms of how it operates its finances, if you know what I mean.
Yes, it does, but obviously this is not just limited to eThekwini. In fact, we see it right across the board. We see majority of the cities, and when you speak about unlivable and about those that are not able to pay any rates and taxes, we see it in many parts. We see it in Johannesburg. We see it in sections.
Correct.
In fact, I know the Hillbrow area in Johannesburg, in particular, high-rise buildings. But when you look at all the living conditions of people at this point in time, buildings being hijacked, all of that, at the end of the day, huge, massive revenue losses for the city in itself. And again, unlivable, not only from a financial perspective, but in more ways than one.
I mean, the losses are across the board. Firstly, we need to understand that ultimately, at some point, there were owners of these properties that have been hijacked. Number one. Number two, when these buildings are hijacked, remember, there's no one really that the city can actually build. And as you know, basic human services dictate that water is a basic human right, and that water is now given away for free. But we need to ask the really hard questions: who pays for these services? Who pays for this water? Who pays for the electricity that's being stolen? Who pays for the roads that are being used by people that aren't really paying for those services? And those are the things that really concern us today in these current times. So, with that being said, Inayat, we must really get down to exactly how is it that we progress the discussion with cities. And I'm seeing plenty of movements. I think there's a meeting tonight with ratepayer associations and the mayor. I mean, obviously, it's quite clear that the budget has already been approved. There's no way that the mayor can walk into a meeting and say that, no, he's going to reduce your rates or do this or do that, because the budget has been preset. It takes active citizenry to come together now before next year's budget to say, what do we want our city to look like? Number one. And remember, in every single city, there are ward councillors. These ward councillors would sit still until you have a problem. So basically, everything has become responsive and reactive, like every organism of state. And ultimately, right now, it takes citizens to come together to say, we need to now start getting our councillor involved and get those councillors, no matter what party they come from, it doesn't really matter, right? But get them involved and say, what do you expect in your ward and how do you want it developed? And make sure those councillors project those budgets in the next financial year. So that way, whatever it is that you required needs to happen. And if it's something that's urgent, there is something called reprioritization of funds, and those things need to start happening. But ultimately, it comes down to where councillors are not doing their job. They're not informing the citizens of what they want, and in terms of a plan and how do we move forward. But with that being said, Inayat, it's compounded to say that what are we doing about land invasion? What are we doing about homelessness? What are we doing about all of these social ills as a city and as society together in partnership? Because if we don't take care of this, and my message is, if we don't take care of it now, then in the next 5 to 10 years, cities are going to become so rampantly full of people that cannot afford to pay for services. The burden of those payments and the burden of a 60 billion rand budget within a city is ultimately going to come from those few that can afford to pay. And that's the climate I'm talking about. When it's going to be unlivable in terms of financially, as well as in terms of how you go about your activities within the city. I mean, right now, people in the CBD can't really perform their businesses because people don't want to come into the CBD. They can't walk and have access freely. There's robberies. Your cars are getting jacked. You've got car guards all over the city pretending to look after your vehicle, but when in fact we've seen on many instances, those are the very individuals breaking into your vehicle. And that's currently the climate at the moment.
Yes, Imtiaz, you speak of the councillors, and just yesterday I was at a funeral actually, and I bumped into one of the councillors, and he raised this issue that, he says his hands are also so tied to a large extent where they raise a number of issues at council level and also in terms of caucuses. And once again, he mentioned the whole issue, and I know it's like beating a dead horse, party politics obviously featuring
Correct.
very, very prominently. And again, he says the political dynamics. He says, I'm close to the people. I know what my people want. I raise these issues over and over again. But again, he says all these party politics, political dynamics that are playing out really is hampering. And he says, makes me look like I'm the bad guy.
The thing is, I hear him, and I'm quite well versed in understanding where he comes from. But ultimately, it comes down to exactly where are these parties, what have they spoken to, and what is their one plan? What is their plan in saying, let us fix at least one thing across the city. Let's fix that. In terms of revenue, why are we being taxed so much? But that's a topic for another day, right? But ultimately, right now, it comes down to civil society standing up. We're seeing mass movements. Everyone's speaking about economic transformation and all the different agendas. Where are you? Where are you as the minorities? When are you standing up? And when are you going to stand up? When it's too late? Ultimately, there's ratepayers associations and all of these organizations. Let me be quite frank about it. We're seeing in these organizations and civic bodies that there's internal egos and pride and all of these things coming to the fore. Ultimately, every organization has a right to decide and dictate what they stand for. Ultimately, it doesn't mean that you also in the same sphere, facing the same issues, should or should not support them. You have a right to refrain or speak about whatever you want to speak to, but don't go up against them to say that, no, they're doing something wrong. No, that's incorrect. If there's a few individuals that are saying that they stand for X, Y, and Z in terms of whether they want to have a rates boycott or whatever it is, then let them do it. If they've discussed the complete legalities of the situation and all of that, they should go ahead and do it. On the other side of the coin, you'd have different organizations saying, no, we don't stand for it. That's fine. If you want to still work with the city, go ahead and try and get your agenda pushed. But everyone has different agendas in terms of how far they want to take the argument. And right now in the climate we are, it's going to take a lot of guts. It's going to take some tenacity, and it's going to take people that can lead you from the front and say, this is the direction we go. However, fear is settling in. And when fear sets in, and this is ultimately the climate we're in, where fear is something that people have within them, where they can't really push their agenda or be vociferous about it, and they're just saying, you know what, let's not cause problems, let's just keep the peace, let's move on. But when there's an injustice, people need to uprise, people need to stand up. And that's what I'm saying. In whatever way, whether it's you care about animals or monkeys or whatever it is. At the end of the day, if you stand for something, today is the time for you to start standing up, because in this country, the current government that we have is not going to stand for anything you believe in. They have their own agenda, and correctly so as well, because they represent a population that have come from apartheid. They have their own agendas, and that's ultimately the climate. But where do we cut out our space, and where do we speak to our issues? If we don't uprise, we are not going to be heard, and that's my message.
Well, Imtiaz, Jazakallah khairan so much for that. And as always, for your time, same place next week, inshallah. We'll meet again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Imtiaz Syed was us this morning at eThekwini Secure weekly edition of Crime Talk. And again, looking at our cities. And we know, all of us, I think at the end of the day, you don't even want to be in any city center today. The time is just gone 2 minutes past 9. Syed standing by.